In the archives of paranormal investigators and trauma counselors, there exist testimonies so harrowing that they have been deliberately suppressed from public knowledge. These are not campfire tales or folklore. These are first-hand accounts from credible witnesses who survived encounters so nightmarish that their stories have been buried to protect both the tellers and society itself. Today, we will reveal the most disturbing Bigfoot stories ever told, testimonies that expose a truth too horrifying for the world to accept. That deep in our forests stalks a predator so intelligent, so malevolent, that those who encounter it and live to tell the tale are forever changed by the unspeakable horror they witnessed in the darkness.
Somebody over there. They're supposed to be in our woods.
In November 2020, veteran hunter Thaddeus Ravenclaw was tracking elk in the remote Blackmore Mountains when he witnessed something that revealed the horrifying truth about decades of missing hunters in the region. On his third day hunting, approximately 8 miles from base camp, Thaddeus noticed the forest had become unnaturally quiet. Against his better judgment, Thaddeus investigated, positioning himself behind a fallen log on a ridge overlooking a small valley. Through his rifle scope, Thaddeus saw another hunter moving through the forest below. Everything appeared normal, but Thaddeus could see what the hunter couldn't: something massive stalking him from the tree line. The creature moved with fluid grace between the shadows, standing at least 11 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they filled spaces between trees. It demonstrated predatory precision that spoke to years of experience hunting human prey, matching the hunter's pace exactly, studying patterns, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The stalking was methodical and calculated. The creature matched the hunter's pace exactly, maintaining consistent distance. When the hunter paused, it paused. When he changed direction, it adjusted accordingly. This wasn't animal behavior. This was calculated predation by an intelligence that understood human psychology and behavior patterns with terrifying sophistication. The creature studied its prey with the patience of a master predator, learning patterns and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. It moved ahead of the hunter, positioning itself to observe from multiple angles. It wasn't just following, it was herding, subtly influencing the hunter's path towards some predetermined kill zone where the attack would be most effective. Most disturbing was the creature's obvious tactical intelligence. It considered wind direction, terrain advantages, escape routes, and optimal attack positions with military-level strategic planning. This suggested extensive practice on human subjects, refining its methods through systematic predation conducted over many years of hunting human beings in these remote mountains. The creature's size alone was terrifying. Through his scope, Thaddeus could see that it stood at least 11 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the spaces between trees. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging down past its knees and ending in hands that appeared capable of crushing human bones like twigs. The creature's entire physiology seemed designed for violence, every aspect of its anatomy optimized for the systematic destruction of human life. At 2:15 p.m., the attack began. The hunter had stopped in a clearing to examine tracks when the creature emerged from the tree line with explosive speed that defied its massive size. Thaddeus got his first clear view of the attacker, a bipedal nightmare covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature's face was a horrifying amalgamation of human and beast, with features that suggested intelligence but were twisted by malevolence and an insatiable hunger for violence. Its eyes burned with an awareness that was unmistakably conscious, calculating, and utterly without mercy. The intelligence behind those eyes was ancient and malevolent, focused entirely on causing maximum suffering to its human prey. The creature's mouth was filled with teeth that were designed not just for killing, but for the systematic dismantling of its victims while they were still alive. The teeth were arranged in rows like a shark's, but they were larger and more varied in shape, suggesting different functions for different types of tissue destruction. Some were designed for cutting, others for grinding, and still others for the precise extraction of specific anatomical components. The hunter had no time to react. The creature struck with tremendous force, sending him flying across the clearing like a child's toy. The impact was so violent that Thaddeus could hear the sound of breaking bones even from his position 300 yards away. The hunter's rifle was torn from his hands and thrown deep into the forest, leaving him completely defenseless against his attacker. Thaddeus found himself frozen in absolute terror. His body refused to respond to his mind's desperate commands to move, to run, to do anything. He could only watch in paralyzed horror as the nightmare unfolded before him. His hunting instincts, honed by decades of experience, screamed at him to flee, but his muscles had turned to stone, leaving him trapped in his own body as a helpless witness to unspeakable horror. The creature didn't kill immediately. Instead, it began systematic assault that demonstrated both intelligence and sadistic pleasure in causing suffering. The creature grabbed the hunter by his legs and began swinging him against nearby trees, using the man's body as a weapon against the forest itself. Each impact was calculated to cause maximum damage while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. The sounds that emerged from the clearing were unlike anything Thaddeus had ever heard. The hunter's screams were not just expressions of pain, they were sounds of absolute terror, the vocalizations of someone who had realized that death would not come quickly or mercifully. The screams echoed across the valley, creating haunting sounds that seemed to energize the creature and drive it to greater heights of violence. Thaddeus watched, unable to move, unable to look away, as the creature's face showed obvious pleasure at the sounds of breaking bones and agonized screams. It would pause between impacts, tilting its massive head as if listening to the hunter's screams with the appreciation of a connoisseur. The creature seemed to be savoring the sounds of suffering, taking time to appreciate the fear in its victim's eyes before continuing the systematic destruction of his body. The systematic nature was most disturbing. The creature wasn't acting on instinct or hunger. It was deliberately prolonging suffering, taking obvious pleasure in terror and pain. Each impact was calculated to cause maximum damage while keeping the victim conscious as long as possible. This was not random violence. It was systematic torture conducted by an intelligence that understood exactly what it was doing. After several minutes of this brutal assault, the creature changed tactics. It threw the hunter to the ground and began systematically breaking bones with its massive hands, starting with the man's fingers and working its way up his arms. The creature's movements were deliberate and methodical, suggesting extensive experience with this type of torture. Thaddeus's hands shook violently as he tried to process what he was witnessing, but his body remained frozen in place. The creature's hands were perfectly adapted for this work. Its fingers ended in claws that were sharp enough to pierce flesh, but controlled enough to avoid causing immediate death. The creature demonstrated surgical precision in its torture, breaking bones in specific sequences that would maximize pain while preventing shock or unconsciousness. The creature's hands were perfectly designed for systematic torture. Each finger was tipped with a claw that could be used with surgical precision, capable of making cuts that would cause maximum pain without causing fatal blood loss. The creature's grip strength was tremendous, allowing it to apply exactly the right amount of pressure to break bones without crushing them completely. The hunter's screams grew weaker as shock and blood loss began to take their toll, but the creature seemed to understand exactly how to keep its victim conscious and aware of what was happening. It would pause periodically, allowing the hunter to recover slightly before continuing its systematic destruction of his body. During these pauses, the creature would examine its work with obvious satisfaction, flexing the broken limbs and testing the damage it had caused. The creature took particular pleasure in the unnatural angles at which the bones now bent. It would manipulate the broken limbs, creating new configurations of damage and studying the hunter's reactions to different types of pain. The creature was not just torturing its victim, it was conducting experiments, learning about human anatomy and pain tolerance through direct observation and systematic experimentation. Thaddeus watched in paralyzed horror as the creature demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy that would be impressive in a medical professional, but was terrifying in a predator. The creature knew exactly which bones to break first, which nerve centers to target, which cuts would cause maximum pain without fatal blood loss. The level of anatomical expertise was disturbing in its implications. The torture continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 to 40 minutes. The creature had developed specific techniques for different types of torture, breaking bones in particular sequences, positioning the victim to maximize both pain and consciousness duration. The level of refinement suggested years of practice on human subjects, perfecting methods through extensive experimentation. The creature's methods were varied and sophisticated. It would twist limbs until joints dislocated, apply pressure to nerve centers to create waves of agony, and use its claws to make precise cuts that would cause maximum pain without causing fatal blood loss. The creature demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy that suggested it had been studying human physiology through direct experimentation for many years. Throughout this prolonged torture, Thaddeus remained frozen in his hiding spot, his mind screaming at his body to move, to help, to do something, but his muscles refused to respond. He was trapped in his own paralyzed body, forced to witness every horrific detail of the systematic destruction taking place below. His rifle lay useless in his hands, too far away to be effective even if he could overcome his paralysis. The creature seemed to understand exactly how much damage it could inflict without causing immediate death. It knew which bones to break first, which nerve centers to target, which cuts would cause maximum pain without fatal blood loss. The level of expertise was terrifying in its implications, suggesting that this creature had been perfecting its torture methods through extensive practice on human victims. The creature began experimenting with different torture methods, testing the hunter's responses to various types of trauma. It would apply pressure to specific points on the body, watching with clinical interest as the victim's reactions provided data about human pain thresholds and anatomical vulnerabilities. The systematic nature of this experimentation was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what Thaddeus witnessed. The creature wasn't simply causing pain, it was conducting research, gathering information about human physiology through direct observation and experimentation on a living subject. The creature would create specific types of injuries, then pause to study the effects, taking mental notes about which methods produced the most interesting results. The creature demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond instinctive predation. It understood human anatomy with the precision of a surgeon, knowing exactly which injuries would cause specific types of pain, which damage would be temporary versus permanent, and how to maintain consciousness despite extreme trauma. This level of knowledge could only have been acquired through extensive practice on human subjects. As the torture continued, the creature began to vary its methods, testing different approaches to see which produced the most interesting results. It would break bones in new patterns, apply pressure to different nerve clusters, and create injuries that interacted with each other to produce compound effects. The hunter's body became a canvas for the creature's experimentation. The creature's approach to torture was methodical and scientific, suggesting that it had been refining its techniques through extensive practice on human subjects over many years. Each movement was purposeful, each injury carefully calculated to provide specific information about human physiology and pain tolerance. The creature was building a comprehensive understanding of human suffering through systematic torture. Thaddeus watched in horror as the creature began to focus on specific anatomical systems, testing the limits of human endurance in different areas of the body. It would spend long minutes working on individual limbs, studying the effects of different types of damage with the dedication of a researcher conducting important experiments. The creature's torture techniques were sophisticated and refined. It knew how to break bones in ways that would cause maximum pain, how to dislocate joints to create specific types of agony, and how to use its claws to make cuts that would interact with broken bones to produce compound pain effects. The level of sophistication suggested years of practice and refinement. The creature seemed to take particular interest in the hunter's reactions to different types of pain. It would pause after each new injury to study the victim's face, watching for specific responses that would provide information about the effectiveness of different torture methods. The creature was learning, gathering data that would make it even more effective in future attacks. The systematic nature of the experimentation was terrifying in its implications. The creature wasn't just torturing for pleasure, it was conducting research that would improve its methods and make future attacks even more horrific. Each victim was providing data that would be used to refine the creature's techniques and make subsequent tortures more effective. After an eternity of systematic torture and experimentation, the creature began the final phase of its attack. It grabbed the hunter's head in its massive hands and began applying pressure, slowly crushing the skull while the victim remained alive and aware. The hunter's final screams were cut short as his skull collapsed under the tremendous force applied by the creature's powerful hands. The skull-crushing sound was audible even at Thaddeus's distance, a wet, grinding noise that spoke of tremendous pressure being applied to bone and brain tissue. The creature held the crushed skull for several moments, seeming to savor the moment of death before finally releasing its grip. The creature's face showed an expression of satisfaction and completion, as if it had achieved some important goal. But the horror wasn't over. The creature began a grotesque post-mortem ritual that revealed the true fate of all the missing hunters. The creature systematically dismantled the body, breaking bones and tearing flesh with methodical precision. It consumed some parts immediately, gnawing on bones to extract marrow while the blood was still fresh, creating sounds that echoed across the valley. The feeding behavior was not random or instinctive. The creature selected specific parts of the body, consuming them in a particular order that suggested ritual significance. It would pause between feeding to examine the remaining corpse, as if planning the next phase of its consumption according to some predetermined protocol that had been developed through years of practice. Thaddeus watched in paralyzed revulsion as the creature demonstrated anatomical knowledge that went far beyond simple predation. It knew which organs to consume first, which bones contained the most marrow, which parts of the body would provide the most nutritional value. The creature's feeding was efficient and systematic, suggesting that it had developed these techniques through extensive practice on human victims. The creature's feeding was accompanied by sounds that Thaddeus would never forget: the crack of bones being broken, the wet tearing of flesh, and a low rumbling that might have been the creature's expression of satisfaction. The sounds carried across the valley, creating an audio landscape that belonged in the deepest circles of hell rather than any earthly forest. The most disturbing aspect of this post-mortem ritual was the creature's obvious pleasure in its work. It would pause periodically to examine its handiwork, seeming to take satisfaction in the destruction it had caused. This wasn't simple feeding behavior. It was a celebration of violence conducted by an intelligence that understood exactly what it was doing and took pride in its achievements. The creature gathered the remaining bones and body parts, loading them into a crude sack made from animal hide. The creature was collecting trophies, taking parts of its victim back to some unknown location where they would join the remains of all the other missing hunters. The sack itself was disturbing in its implications, clearly handmade and stitched together with what appeared to be sinew or dried intestines. The creature had crafted tools for its hunting activities, suggesting a level of intelligence and planning that went far beyond simple animal behavior. The sack was not the only tool the creature possessed. Thaddeus could see other implements hanging from its belt, crude but effective devices that had been designed for specific aspects of hunting and processing human prey. Then came the methodical evidence elimination. The creature systematically eliminated all evidence of what had occurred. It scattered the hunter's gear across a wide area, buried some items, and threw others into dense undergrowth where they would never be found. The creature understood the importance of concealing its activities, suggesting intelligence that went far beyond simple animal cunning. Most disturbing of all was the creature's methodical approach to evidence elimination. It used branches to obscure bloodstains on the ground, moved rocks to cover disturbed earth, and even rearranged vegetation to make the clearing appear undisturbed. The creature understood human search methods and was taking specific steps to ensure that no evidence of its activities would be discovered. The creature's knowledge of human behavior was extensive and terrifying. It knew how search teams operated, what they looked for, and how to eliminate the specific types of evidence that would lead to discovery. This suggested that the creature had been observing human activities for years, learning their methods and developing countermeasures that would allow it to continue its predation without detection. Within 2 hours of the attack, the clearing showed no obvious signs of what had transpired. The creature had removed the body, scattered the evidence, and transformed the scene of brutal murder into what appeared to be an ordinary forest clearing. Any search team that investigated the area would find nothing to indicate what had happened to the missing hunter. As the creature finished its work, it slowly turned and looked directly toward Thaddeus's hiding spot. For a terrifying moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the distance. The creature's gaze held unmistakable intelligence, aware, calculating, and utterly without mercy. In that moment of eye contact, Thaddeus realized with absolute certainty that the creature had been aware of his presence throughout the entire attack. It had allowed him to witness its work, perhaps even performed for his benefit, demonstrating its methods and capabilities to someone who would carry the knowledge of its existence back to the human world. The creature's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, evaluating him with the same clinical detachment it had shown while torturing its victim. Thaddeus could see the intelligence behind those eyes, making a decision about whether to add him to its collection or allow him to escape with the knowledge of what he had witnessed. That moment of recognition broke Thaddeus's paralysis like a gunshot. Pure, primal terror flooded his system, overriding the shock that had kept him frozen for the past 2 hours. His body finally responded to his mind's desperate commands, and he exploded from his hiding spot in blind panic, crashing through the undergrowth without regard for stealth or safety. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at his clothes and skin as he fled in absolute terror. Behind him, he could hear the creature's roar of rage, a sound that seemed to shake the very mountains, and spoke of fury at having its prey escape. The sound was unlike anything in nature, a vocalization that combined animal rage with intelligent frustration. The sound of massive footsteps thundered behind him, each impact seeming to shake the ground beneath his feet. The creature was pursuing him with the same methodical precision it had shown in its attack. But now there was urgency in its movements, anger at being denied another victim for its collection of human trophies. Thaddeus ran with superhuman speed, born of pure terror, crashing through dense forest without regard for the branches that tore at his flesh or the rocks that bruised his feet. He could hear the creature behind him, its breathing like a steam engine, its footsteps getting closer with each passing second. The creature's pursuit was relentless and methodical. As he crashed through a particularly dense thicket, Thaddeus caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run even colder. Through the trees to his left, another massive form was moving parallel to his path. At first, he thought it might be another tree or a large boulder, but as his terror-sharpened vision focused, he realized with absolute horror that it was another creature. This second creature was similar in size and build to his pursuer, but it wasn't participating in the chase. Instead, it was simply watching, moving through the forest with the same fluid grace, but maintaining a consistent distance. The creature's posture suggested casual observation rather than active hunting, as if it were merely a spectator to the deadly game unfolding in the forest. The realization that there were multiple creatures in these mountains hit Thaddeus like a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated predator. This was evidence of a population, a community of these nightmarish beings that had been systematically hunting human beings in the remote wilderness areas. The implications were staggering and terrifying beyond comprehension. The watching creature's behavior suggested a social structure among these beings. It wasn't interfering with the hunt. respecting what appeared to be territorial boundaries or hunting protocols. The creature seemed content to observe, perhaps learning from the techniques being employed by its companion, or simply enjoying the spectacle of human terror and desperation. As Thaddeus continued his desperate flight, he could see the watching creature keeping pace through the trees, its massive form moving with the same silent efficiency that characterized these beings. The creature's eyes were visible even at distance, burning with the same intelligent malevolence that had characterized his pursuer. But there was also something that might have been amusement in its gaze. The presence of the second creature added a new dimension of terror to Thaddeus's flight. Not only was he being hunted by one of these nightmarish beings, but he was also being observed by another, as if his desperate attempt to escape was providing entertainment for these ancient predators. The psychological impact of being watched while fleeing for his life was almost as terrifying as the physical pursuit itself. The watching creature's behavior suggested that these beings had developed complex social behaviors around their predation of human beings. There were apparently rules and protocols governing their hunts, territorial boundaries that were respected, and perhaps even hierarchies that determined which creature had the right to pursue specific prey. The pursuit seemed to last forever, though it was probably only minutes. Thaddeus's lungs burned, his legs screamed in agony, but the terror of what was behind him and what was watching from the side drove him forward beyond the limits of human endurance. He could feel both creatures' presence like physical weights, pressing against his consciousness and filling him with the absolute certainty that he was completely outmatched. Just when he thought the pursuing creature would catch him, when he could almost feel those claws tearing into his back, Thaddeus burst through a line of trees and found himself at the edge of a deep, fast-flowing river. The water was dark and cold, rushing between steep banks with a current that spoke of dangerous depths and hidden obstacles. Without hesitation, driven by pure survival instinct and the absolute certainty that the water offered his only chance of escape, Thaddeus launched himself into the churning water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and shocking his system. The current immediately grabbed him, pulling him downstream with tremendous force that threatened to dash him against the rocks. As he struggled to keep his head above water, fighting against the current that threatened to drag him under and drown him, Thaddeus looked back toward the riverbank. Both creatures now stood at the water's edge, their massive forms silhouetted against the darkening sky like primordial nightmares given physical form. The pursuing creature's eyes burned with frustrated rage, but neither creature made any attempt to enter the river. Whether they couldn't swim or simply chose not to pursue him into the water, Thaddeus would never know. But their reluctance to follow gave him hope for the first time since the nightmare began. Both creatures watched him with those calculating eyes as the current carried him downstream, their gazes never wavering even as the distance between them increased. There was something almost respectful in their observation, as if they acknowledged that their prey had earned its escape through courage and quick thinking rather than mere luck. The watching creature seemed to communicate something to the pursuer, though Thaddeus couldn't hear any sounds over the rushing water. The interaction between the two beings suggested a level of communication and social organization that was terrifying in its implications for human safety in these remote wilderness areas. Thaddeus fought against the current, using every ounce of his remaining strength to swim toward the opposite bank. The water was brutally cold, sapping his energy and threatening to drag him under with each passing moment. Several times he went under, swallowing mouthfuls of river water, but somehow he managed to keep fighting against the current that wanted to claim his life. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Thaddeus finally managed to grab hold of a fallen tree branch extending into the water from the opposite bank. Using the last of his strength, he hauled himself out of the river and collapsed on the muddy shore, gasping and shivering uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. He lay there for a long time, too exhausted to move, too traumatized to think clearly about what he had witnessed. When he finally gathered the strength to look back across the river, both creatures were gone, vanished into the forest as silently as they had appeared, leaving no trace of their presence except for the horrific memories burned into Thaddeus's mind. Thaddeus spent the night huddled against a tree, too terrified to sleep, jumping at every sound the forest made around him. When dawn broke, he began walking downstream, following the river toward civilization. He was found 24 hours later by a search and rescue team, hypothermic, dehydrated, and in a state of severe psychological shock. The rescuers found him sitting by the riverbank, staring across the water with vacant eyes, muttering incoherently about multiple creatures in the forest. He was immediately airlifted to the nearest hospital, where doctors treated him for exposure and exhaustion, but the physical injuries were nothing compared to the psychological trauma. Thaddeus was no longer the confident, experienced hunter who had entered the mountains 3 days earlier. He had become something else, a broken man haunted by knowledge too terrible to share. His claims about multiple creatures were dismissed as hallucinations brought on by exposure and trauma. On June 4, 2024, a girl recorded Bigfoot having a horrifying conversation with her for multiple minutes. What was a normal day for her turned into concrete evidence that he can communicate with human beings. Never before was a fragment of the Sasquatch speaking this long, and what he told her changed what we know about Bigfoot forever. Documentary maker Maya Thornton had been recording for less than an hour when her equipment started registering sounds that didn't match any animal in her extensive audio database. The words she heard were distorted, formed by a vocal apparatus not designed for human language, but the intention was clear. Something was trying to talk to her, and it had been practicing. The first word was barely recognizable, a drawn-out sound that might have been you or who, followed by a long pause, as if the speaker was waiting for confirmation that Maya had understood. She remained motionless, her hand hovering over the record button that was already capturing everything, her mind racing through protocols she'd developed for this exact scenario, even though part of her had never truly believed it would happen. The voice came again, clearer this time, and Maya's audio software registered it as originating from approximately 40 feet away, hidden in the dense undergrowth where her cameras couldn't penetrate. The creature, and Maya's scientific training, insisted on that term even as her instinct screamed that this was something more, seemed to be choosing its words carefully, speaking with the deliberation of someone using a second language they'd learned through observation rather than instruction. What it said next would be debated by experts for its implications about consciousness and intelligence, but the meaning was unmistakable. It wanted to know why she had come and whether she was finally ready to listen. Maya's response was instinctive, a whispered acknowledgement that yes, she could hear it. Yes, she was listening, words that felt inadequate for a moment, that was rewriting everything she thought she knew about the natural world. The creature's reaction was immediate, a sound that might have been satisfaction or relief, followed by movement that brought it closer to the clearing's edge. Still concealed, but nowhere near enough that Maya could hear its breathing, deep and measured like someone preparing to deliver a rehearsed speech. Her cameras captured the vegetation moving, branches swaying without wind, and her audio equipment registered multiple sources now, suggesting that other creatures had moved into position around the clearing, forming an audience or perhaps a security perimeter for what was about to unfold. The primary voice spoke again, and this time the words came in a sequence that suggested not just communication, but storytelling. A narrative that had been waiting generations to be shared with someone who possessed both the technology to record it and the willingness to believe. The creature's account, delivered in halting English mixed with sounds that defied transcription, painted a picture of a species that had been observing human development for centuries, watching from the margins as civilization expanded into territories they'd occupied since before recorded history. It spoke of deliberate concealment, of a collective decision made long ago to remain hidden from a species that had proven itself dangerous to anything it didn't understand, and of the careful selection of individuals like Maya who might serve as bridges between worlds that had existed in parallel for too long. The voice described a society with its own language, its own history, its own understanding of the forest that predated human presence in North America. And it spoke with a sadness that transcended species about the shrinking territories and the growing difficulty of maintaining separation from a human population that was pushing into every remaining wild space. Most disturbing was its explanation for why it had chosen to break centuries of silence now. Because time was running out, and decisions needed to be made about whether continued hiding was possible or whether some form of controlled contact was inevitable. Maya's questions, whispered into her recording equipment, were met with responses that demonstrated the creature's sophisticated understanding of human society and technology. It knew about cameras, about the internet, about the way information spread through human networks, and it expressed concern about what would happen if proof of its species' existence became undeniable. The conversation touched on topics that seemed impossible for a forest-dwelling creature to comprehend: government responses, scientific study, the loss of autonomy that would come with discovery. And Maya realized with growing astonishment that she was speaking with an intelligence that had been studying humanity as carefully as humans studied wildlife, learning languages through eavesdropping on hikers and campers, understanding technology through observation of the equipment that researchers brought into the forest. The creature spoke of others like itself who had learned different human languages, who monitored radio communications and even accessed the internet through methods it didn't fully explain, painting a picture of a hidden civilization that was far more aware of the modern world than anyone had imagined possible. The conversation took a darker turn when Maya asked about the reports of aggressive encounters, the stories of hikers being chased or intimidated by massive figures in the forest. The creature's response carried what sounded like regret mixed with justification. It described a species under pressure, defending territories that were being encroached upon, sometimes using fear as a tool to drive humans away from areas that were considered sacred or essential to their survival. It spoke of younger members of its kind who were less patient with the policy of concealment, who wanted to confront the human expansion more directly, and of growing tensions within its society about how to respond to a world that was leaving fewer and fewer places to hide. Most chilling was its admission that some encounters had been tests, deliberate interactions designed to gauge human responses and gather information about how individuals would react to contact, experiments that had been ongoing for decades as its kind tried to predict what would happen if full disclosure became unavoidable. Maya's audio equipment captured nuances in the creature's voice that suggested emotional complexity, frustration, hope, fear, and something that might have been loneliness, the isolation of a species that had chosen invisibility over the risks of recognition. The creature asked Maya questions in return, wanting to know about human intentions, about whether people like her who sought contact came with peaceful purposes, or whether discovery would inevitably lead to exploitation and destruction. Its concerns revealed a sophisticated understanding of human history, referencing the treatment of indigenous peoples and endangered species with a knowledge that suggested extensive observation of human behavior patterns. The conversation became a negotiation, with the creature trying to assess whether Maya could be trusted to present its kind's existence in a way that might lead to coexistence rather than catastrophe, and Maya struggling to provide assurances she wasn't certain she could guarantee. The other creatures that had positioned themselves around the clearing began to vocalize, their calls creating a chorus that Maya's equipment registered as coming from at least 6 different sources, each with distinct vocal characteristics that suggested individual identities rather than a uniform group. The primary speaker seemed to be translating or summarizing their contributions, explaining that its companions represented different perspectives within their community. Some who supported this contact, others who viewed it as a dangerous mistake, and still others who believed that humanity had already progressed too far to be trusted with knowledge of their existence. The debate playing out in the forest around Maya was apparently one that had been ongoing within the creature's society for generations, and her presence had forced it into the open, making her an unwitting participant in a decision that would affect an entire hidden species. As the conversation continued, Maya noticed that the creature's English was improving in real time, as if the practice of actually speaking with a human was refining skills that had been developed only through passive observation. It began using more complex sentence structures, incorporating idioms and references that suggested it had been listening to human conversations for years, absorbing language through patient eavesdropping on camping groups and hikers who never suspected their words were being studied by an intelligence hidden in the surrounding forest. The creature expressed frustration with the limitations of human language for conveying concepts that existed in its own communication system, describing ideas about forest consciousness and interconnected awareness that didn't translate well into English, but suggested a worldview fundamentally different from human understanding. It spoke of the forest as a living network of trees and animals and its own kind as parts of a larger organism that humans move through without comprehending. And it suggested that this blindness to the deeper patterns of wilderness was why humans could destroy ecosystems without understanding what they were actually eliminating. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all the creatures fall silent. The distant noise of a helicopter, probably a routine Forest Service patrol, but enough to trigger an immediate response from Maya's hidden companions. The primary speaker's voice took on an urgent quality, explaining that they needed to end the contact, that the risk of detection was too great, but before withdrawing it wanted to establish a method for future communication. What it proposed seemed impossible. It described a location deeper in the mountains where Maya could leave messages, a place its kind monitored regularly, and it suggested a schedule for potential future meetings if she proved trustworthy with the information she'd already gathered. The creature made Maya promise something that would haunt her for months afterward, that she would share the recording only with people who would approach the revelation with respect rather than exploitation. A request that assumed she had far more control over information dissemination than any individual actually possessed in the modern world. As the creatures withdrew into the forest, Maya's cameras captured brief glimpses of massive forms moving through the undergrowth with impossible stealth. Figures that seemed too large to disappear so completely, yet vanished within seconds, leaving only swaying branches and disturbed vegetation as evidence they'd been there at all. The primary speaker's final words were a warning and an invitation, a caution that not all of its kind were as willing to attempt communication, that some territories were defended with violence rather than words, but also an expression of hope that Maya represented a new possibility for a species that was tired of hiding. The voice faded into the forest, and Maya was left alone in the clearing with equipment that had recorded something that would either revolutionize understanding of intelligence and consciousness or destroy her credibility as a researcher, depending on who heard it and whether they chose to believe. Maya remained in the clearing for another hour, her hands shaking as she reviewed the audio files, listening to the conversation replay and trying to convince herself it had actually happened. The recording was clear, undeniable, showing waveforms and frequency patterns that didn't match any known animal, but also didn't match human speech exactly, existing in a space between that suggested a vocal apparatus adapted for different purposes, attempting to mimic human language. Her video footage showed movement, shadows, the disturbance of vegetation, but never a clear image of the speakers, as if they'd positioned themselves with perfect awareness of her camera angles and deliberately stayed just beyond the range of visual documentation. The evidence was compelling but incomplete, enough to prove something extraordinary had occurred, but not enough to satisfy the burden of proof that scientific acceptance would require. The hike back to her vehicle became a journey through a forest that felt fundamentally different from the one she'd entered that morning. Maya found herself noticing things she'd overlooked before, arrangements of stones that might be markers, broken branches positioned in patterns that could be signals, and areas where the forest floor showed signs of regular passage by something that moved on two legs but left tracks too large and too deep to be human. She realized that the creature's claim of extensive observation was evident everywhere once you knew what to look for, that the forest was full of signs of an intelligence that had been hiding in plain sight, camouflaged not just by physical concealment but by human assumptions about what was possible. Every sound made her pause, wondering if she was being followed, if her new contacts were ensuring she made it safely out of their territory, or if other members of their kind who hadn't approved of the contact were tracking her movements with less friendly intentions. Maya's heart pounded as she whispered her response into the recording equipment, asking the creature what it wanted her to know, what message it had been waiting to deliver. The being's answer came slowly, each word carefully formed, as if it was translating thoughts from a language far older than English into sounds her human ears could process. It spoke of watching humans for generations, of learning their languages by listening to campfire conversations and radio transmissions that drifted through the forest, of understanding technology through careful observation of the equipment that researchers brought into the wilderness. The creature described a species that had made a collective decision centuries ago to remain hidden, to observe rather than engage, because early encounters with humans had taught them that discovery meant danger, that anything unknown was either destroyed or captured by a species that feared what it couldn't control. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Maya asked how many of them existed in these mountains. The creature's response carried what sounded like sadness. It spoke of a population that had once numbered in the thousands across the Pacific Northwest, but had dwindled to scattered groups of a few hundred, pushed into smaller and smaller territories as human development consumed the wilderness. It described sacred places that had been paved over, migration routes that had been cut by highways, and gathering sites that now sat beneath reservoirs and shopping centers. The being's voice grew heavier as it explained that its kind was facing a choice they'd hoped never to make: continue hiding until there was nowhere left to hide, or risk contact with humans in hopes of finding allies who might help protect what little territory remained. Maya realized with growing horror that she wasn't just documenting an unknown species. She was potentially witnessing the last generation of an ancient civilization in its final desperate attempt to survive. Maya's questions became more urgent, her scientific training warring with the emotional weight of what she was hearing. She asked about their society, their culture, how they'd managed to remain hidden for so long in an age of satellites and thermal imaging. The creature's explanation revealed a sophistication that shattered every assumption Maya had made about what intelligence looked like. It described a network of families spread across multiple mountain ranges, connected not by technology, but by individuals who traveled between groups carrying messages and maintaining social bonds. It spoke of an oral tradition that preserved thousands of years of history, of knowledge about the forest that went deeper than any human science, of an understanding of the interconnected web of life that humans move through without seeing. The being explained that they'd learned to avoid detection through careful study of human behavior patterns. They knew when satellites passed overhead, understood the limitations of thermal cameras, and had developed techniques for moving through the forest that left minimal trace. But most chilling was its admission that they'd also learned to manipulate human perception, to use infrasound and other methods to create feelings of unease that drove people away from areas they wanted to protect, essentially weaponizing human fear to maintain their boundaries. The creature's tone shifted when it began describing the internal conflict within its society about whether to maintain absolute secrecy or attempt controlled contact. It spoke of elders who believed that any interaction with humans would inevitably lead to their destruction, of younger members who argued that hiding was no longer sustainable in a world where wilderness was disappearing, and of a middle faction that believed selective contact with specific humans might be their only path to survival. Maya had apparently been chosen as a test case. Her research, her approach, her obvious respect for the unknown had marked her as someone who might be trusted with knowledge that could either save or doom an entire species. The weight of that responsibility settled over Maya like a physical burden as she realized that her response to this encounter, the choices she made about what to do with this recording, could determine whether these beings continued to exist or were driven into extinction by the exposure she might trigger. As the conversation continued, Maya noticed that other vocalizations were occurring around the clearing. The creature she was speaking with would occasionally pause, and she would hear calls from different directions, followed by responses that suggested consultation was happening, that the being was checking with others before answering certain questions. The primary speaker explained that its companions represented different perspectives within their community, that this conversation was being witnessed and evaluated by others who would help decide whether future contact should continue or whether this experiment should be terminated. Maya asked if she could see them, if they would allow themselves to be photographed, and the creature's response was firm. Visual documentation was not possible, not yet, perhaps not ever. They would control what evidence existed of their presence, would decide what proof humans were allowed to have, because once clear images existed, once their existence became undeniable, they would lose all agency over what happened next. The conversation itself, the audio recording, was a calculated risk, a piece of evidence that proved communication had occurred but still left room for doubt, for deniability, for the possibility of retreat if Maya proved untrustworthy. Maya's audio equipment captured something remarkable in the next exchange. The creature began teaching her words from its own language, simple concepts like forest, water, sky, spoken in sounds that her human vocal cords couldn't hope to reproduce, but that her recording software captured in perfect detail. The being explained that it wanted her to understand that they possessed true language, not just mimicry of human speech, that their communication system was as complex and nuanced as any human tongue. It demonstrated grammatical structures, showed how meaning changed with tonal variations and context, essentially providing linguistic proof that would be invaluable to researchers if Maya chose to share it. But with each word it taught her, the creature also emphasized the trust it was placing in her, the risk it was taking by revealing so much, and the consequences that would follow if that trust was betrayed. The lesson felt less like academic exchange and more like a test of Maya's character, a way of measuring whether she understood the gravity of what was being shared. The conversation took its darkest turn when Maya asked about the aggressive encounters that had been reported over the years, the stories of hikers being chased or intimidated. The creature's response carried what sounded like genuine regret. It acknowledged that fear had been used as a tool, that humans had been deliberately frightened away from certain areas through displays of aggression that were carefully calculated to terrify without causing actual harm. It described these encounters as necessary evils, defensive measures taken to protect territories that were essential to their survival. But it also admitted that not all of its kind agreed with the policy of restraint, that some, particularly younger members who had watched their territories shrink year after year, advocated for more direct confrontation, for using their superior strength and knowledge of the terrain to actively drive humans out of the remaining wilderness. The being's voice carried a warning as it explained that Maya's encounter was happening during a moment of decision within their society, that the choice between continued hiding and open conflict was being debated, and that her response to this contact might influence which path they ultimately chose. As the helicopter sound that had interrupted them earlier grew closer, the creature's final words came in a rush, as if it was trying to convey everything important before the opportunity was lost. It gave Maya specific instructions for a location where she could leave messages, a distinctive rock formation that it described in detail, and it established a schedule for when those messages would be checked. The being made her promise something that would haunt her for months, that she would share the recording only with people who approached the revelation with respect rather than exploitation, that she would use her judgment to determine who could be trusted with knowledge of their existence. It was an impossible request, asking her to control information in a world where nothing stayed secret. But Maya found herself agreeing because the alternative, refusing and potentially ending all future contact, seemed worse. The creature's parting words were both invitation and warning. They would be watching her, monitoring how she handled this responsibility, and future communication would depend entirely on whether she proved worthy of the trust they'd placed in her. The sounds of the creatures withdrawing into the forest came quickly after that, multiple sources moving away from the clearing with coordinated precision that suggested they'd planned their exit strategy before the conversation even began. Maya's cameras captured the vegetation moving, branches swaying as massive forms passed through, but true to their word, the beings never allowed themselves to be clearly visible, maintaining their control over what evidence existed of their presence. Within minutes, the forest had returned to normal sounds, birds resuming their calls, insects buzzing, the ordinary noise of wilderness that had been absent during the entire encounter. Maya sat alone in the clearing, her recording equipment still running, capturing her shaking breaths and the sound of her own voice whispering in disbelief at what had just occurred. The audio file showed a conversation lasting exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. But the implications of those brief minutes would reshape everything Maya thought she knew about intelligence, consciousness, and what it meant to share the world with minds that operated according to rules humanity had never imagined. On March 8, 2024, 26-year-old Sarah Chen drove alone into the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest with nothing but a 2-person tent. She'd chosen a campsite that didn't appear on any official park map, a clearing she'd discovered through satellite imagery that promised complete isolation. When she began the hike, her GPS device began showing coordinates that didn't match her downloaded maps, placing her miles from where she actually stood. Around the 2-hour mark, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. A massive footprint pressed deep into the mud beside the trail, easily 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions that were too human-like to be a bear, but far too large to be anything she could name. When she looked closer, she could see 4 more prints leading into the dense undergrowth, spaced apart in a stride pattern that suggested something walking upright. Sarah's unease grew when she discovered deep parallel gouges carved into tree bark at a height of roughly 8 feet, 3 distinct marks that ran horizontally across the trunk. The wood inside was fresh, still weeping sap, which meant whatever had made them had been here recently, perhaps within the last few hours. She found similar markings on 6 more trees as she continued, always at the same impossible height, always 3 parallel gouges positioned in a way that seemed to mark territorial boundaries. The pattern was too consistent to be random damage, and Sarah began to wonder what kind of creature would need to mark its territory at a height that exceeded any known animal in these mountains. The silence became oppressive as Sarah pushed deeper into the forest, but it wasn't complete silence anymore. She began to notice sounds that didn't fit. Branches would crack in the distance, always just far enough away that she couldn't see what had caused the noise, and occasionally she would hear what sounded like footsteps paralleling her path through the dense undergrowth, keeping pace with her movements. Twice she stopped completely and held her breath, listening, and both times the forest sound stopped as well, as if whatever was out there was also listening, also waiting. When she started walking again, the sounds would resume after a few seconds, maintaining that same careful distance. When Sarah finally reached the clearing just before sunset, she felt an immediate sense of unease that she couldn't rationalize away. The space was perfectly circular, roughly 50 feet in diameter, with grass that grew in strange spiral patterns radiating out from the center. The trees surrounding the clearing were marked with those same deep gouges at exactly the same height. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any dead wood or fallen branches within the clearing itself, as if someone had been maintaining the space. But it was what she found in the center that made her blood run cold, a circle of smooth river stones arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, and in the middle, a collection of bones that had been carefully sorted by size and type, bleached white, but positioned with obvious intention. She set up her tent near the eastern edge of the clearing, trying to shake off the growing feeling that she was intruding somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. Her hands trembled as she hammered in the tent stakes, constantly glancing over her shoulder at the tree line. As she worked, she noticed patches of grass that had been flattened in rough circular patterns, as if something massive had been bedding down in multiple locations, and what appeared to be tufts of dark hair caught on low-hanging branches, coarse strands that were too thick to be from any deer or elk. The tent went up without problems, but her camping stove refused to light, despite having worked perfectly at home, and her phone showed no signal at all. The sun was setting rapidly now, the shadows between the trees growing deeper and somehow more solid. As Sarah ate a cold dinner, she became aware of a smell drifting across the clearing, musky and earthy, like wet animal fur mixed with something stronger, more pungent. The scent came and went on the evening breeze, persistent enough that she couldn't ignore it. When she walked to the edge of the clearing to investigate, she found fresh tracks pressed into the soft earth, the same massive footprints she'd seen on the trail, but these were even clearer. The prints circled her tent in a wide arc, suggesting that something had examined her campsite while she was setting up, then retreated back into the forest to watch from a distance. Whatever had made those tracks was still out there, somewhere in the darkening woods, and it knew exactly where she was. As darkness fell completely, Sarah noticed that the usual sounds of a forest at night, insects, owls, the rustling of nocturnal animals beginning their evening activities, were entirely absent from the clearing. The silence was so profound that she could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing through her ears, could hear every tiny movement she made inside her tent, amplified to an almost painful degree. She lay in her sleeping bag trying to read by headlamp, but found herself unable to concentrate on the words, her attention constantly drawn to the darkness beyond her tent walls and the growing certainty that something out there was paying very close attention to her presence. Around 10 p.m., she turned off her headlamp and tried to sleep, telling herself that her unease was just the normal anxiety of being alone in an unfamiliar place. That morning would bring perspective and the courage to laugh at her nighttime fears. Sarah woke suddenly at 1:33 a.m. to a sound that didn't belong in any forest she'd ever studied or imagined. It started as a low vibration that she felt more than heard, resonating through the ground beneath her sleeping pad and traveling up through her body until her teeth ached and her vision blurred. The sound built slowly into something that resembled a voice, but operated at frequencies that seemed designed to bypass her ears entirely and speak directly to the primitive parts of her brain that still remembered when humans were prey. She lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the vocalization continued for nearly a minute before fading back into that oppressive silence, leaving her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The silence that followed the call lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt like hours to Sarah as she lay frozen in her sleeping bag, straining to hear any indication of what had made that impossible sound. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the clearing with a measured pace that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than the random wandering of an animal. Whatever was out there was big, each footfall creating a vibration she could feel through the ground, and it seemed to be conducting a systematic survey of the area, pausing occasionally as if examining something of interest before continuing its circuit. Sarah's rational mind tried to catalog possibilities, a bear, an elk, maybe even another camper. But the pattern of movement was too methodical, too purposeful, and the weight suggested something far larger than any animal that was supposed to exist in these mountains. The footsteps completed their circuit of the clearing and then, impossibly, began moving directly toward Sarah's tent with the confidence of something that knew exactly where she was and had decided it was time for a closer inspection. Sarah's hand found her headlamp in the darkness, her fingers closing around it, but not yet turning it on, some instinct warning her that revealing her awareness might trigger a response she wasn't prepared to handle. The footsteps stopped approximately 10 feet from her tent, and in the silence that followed, Sarah became aware of a new sound, breathing deep and rhythmic, the exhalations of something with lung capacity far beyond human scale. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and Sarah had the terrifying realization that whatever was out there was standing completely still, simply listening to her the same way she was listening to it. Then came a sound that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. A long, slow inhalation, as if the creature was drawing in her scent, analyzing her presence through smell in a way that felt violently intimate and invasive. The breathing moved closer, and Sarah realized with mounting horror that the creature had dropped to a crouch and was now positioned directly outside her tent wall, separated from her by nothing but a thin layer of nylon that suddenly seemed as insubstantial as tissue paper. She could hear it shifting its weight, could hear what sounded like hands or paws pressing against the ground, could hear the soft rustle of movement that suggested it was leaning in even closer. The tent wall near her head began to bow inward slightly, pressed by something on the other side, and Sarah had to bite down on her sleeping bag to keep from screaming. The creature remained in that position for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally shifting its weight or adjusting its position, but never moving away from the tent, never giving Sarah any indication of what it wanted or what it planned to do next. She could smell it now, a musky, earthy odor that was somehow both animal and not animal, mixed with something that reminded her of wet stone and decaying leaves. The scent was so strong it made her eyes water, and she had to breathe through her mouth to keep from gagging, terrified that any sound she made might trigger an attack or provoke the creature into more aggressive action. Her mind raced through everything she'd learned about wildlife encounters. Make yourself big, make noise, never run. But all of that advice seemed laughably inadequate for whatever was crouched outside her tent in the darkness. At 2:47 a.m., Sarah heard a sound that stopped her heart, the metallic whisper of her tent zipper being slowly, deliberately pulled open from the outside. The movement was controlled and precise, nothing like the random pawing of an animal trying to get at food, and Sarah watched in frozen terror as the zipper traveled down its track with the steady progress of something that understood exactly how the mechanism worked. The creature was opening her tent with the casual competence of someone who had done this before, who knew what zippers were and how they functioned, and that realization was somehow more terrifying than anything else that had happened. Sarah's hand tightened on her headlamp, her thumb finding the power button, her entire body tensed for whatever was about to happen next. The zipper reached the bottom of its track, and the tent flap fell open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to have physical substance, a void that swallowed her headlamp beam before it could illuminate anything useful. Sarah could see a shape in that darkness, a massive silhouette that blocked out the stars, and she could feel hot breath washing over her face in rhythmic waves that smelled of earth and something else she couldn't identify. The creature made a soft sound, almost questioning, and Sarah realized with a jolt of primal terror that it was trying to communicate with her, trying to elicit some kind of response that would help it understand what she was. Her finger pressed the headlamp button before her conscious mind could stop her, and the sudden flood of light revealed something that her brain struggled to process or accept as real. The creature crouched at her tent entrance stood at least 7 feet tall, even in its hunched position, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with a face that was simultaneously human and utterly alien. Its eyes caught her headlamp beam and reflected it back with an amber glow that spoke of intelligence and awareness, studying her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. The being's hand, and it was definitely a hand, not a paw, rested on the tent frame with fingers that were too long and too thick to be human but showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs and the capacity for fine motor control. For 3 heartbeats, Sarah and the creature simply stared at each other, and in that moment of connection, she understood with absolute certainty that this was no animal, no bear or elk, or any other creature that science had cataloged and explained. The creature's reaction to the light was not what Sarah expected. Instead of retreating or attacking, it simply tilted its head in what appeared to be curiosity, studying her face with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that were more human than animal, and it made another soft vocalization that carried tones of what might have been inquiry or greeting. Sarah's terror began to mix with a strange sense of wonder as she realized that the creature wasn't behaving aggressively, wasn't showing any signs of wanting to harm her, but rather seemed genuinely curious about her presence in its territory. The being's eyes moved from her face to her sleeping bag to the interior of her tent, taking in details with obvious intelligence. And Sarah had the bizarre thought that she was being evaluated, assessed according to criteria she couldn't begin to understand. The moment of connection was shattered when Sarah's headlamp began to flicker and dim, the batteries draining at an impossible rate, as if something was actively interfering with the electrical current. The creature's eyes widened slightly at the changing light, and it made a sound that might have been surprise or concern, leaning back from the tent entrance as if giving her space. In the failing light, Sarah caught glimpses of other shapes moving at the edge of the clearing, more massive silhouettes that suggested the creature at her tent wasn't alone, that she was surrounded by multiple beings that had been watching her sleep. The headlamp died completely, plunging everything back into darkness, and Sarah heard the creature at her tent make a series of soft vocalizations that were answered by the others in what sounded unmistakably like conversation. In the darkness, Sarah's other senses became hyper-aware, cataloging details that her panicked mind struggled to process into any coherent understanding. She could hear the creatures moving around the clearing with surprising stealth for beings of their size, could hear what sounded like objects being moved or examined, could hear vocalizations that carried back and forth in patterns that suggested complex communication. The being at her tent entrance remained in position, and Sarah could feel its presence like a physical weight, could sense it watching her, even though she could no longer see its eyes. Minutes passed in this strange standoff, with Sarah too terrified to move, and the creature apparently content to simply observe. And she began to wonder if this was how she would die, not torn apart by a monster, but simply studied to death by something that viewed her as an interesting specimen. Then, without warning, the creature at her tent made a sound that was unmistakably a sigh, a very human gesture of what might have been disappointment or resignation. And Sarah heard it begin to move away from the tent entrance. The zipper was pulled closed from the outside with the same careful precision it had been opened, and the footsteps retreated back toward the tree line, accompanied by the sounds of the other creatures also withdrawing from the clearing. Within minutes, the forest had returned to that oppressive silence, and Sarah was left alone in her tent, shaking uncontrollably and wondering if what had just happened was real or some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But the musky smell remained, and the tent zipper was definitely closed in a way she hadn't left it, and her headlamp batteries were completely drained despite being fresh when she'd started the trip. Sarah didn't sleep for the rest of that night, lying rigid in her sleeping bag with her backup flashlight clutched in her hand, listening for any indication that the creatures might return. As dawn finally began to lighten the sky, she worked up the courage to unzip her tent and look outside, half expecting to find no evidence of the night's encounter, some proof that her exhausted mind had invented the entire experience. What she found instead was a clearing that had been transformed overnight, marked with evidence that couldn't be explained away or rationalized as imagination. Massive footprints circled her tent in perfect spirals, each print measuring at least 18 inches in length and pressed deep into the earth with a weight that suggested something far heavier than any known animal. The footprints weren't the only evidence left behind. Sarah's camping equipment had been moved and rearranged, items taken from her pack and placed in careful arrangements that suggested examination rather than random disturbance. Her food bag, which she'd hung from a tree branch the previous evening, had been lowered to the ground and opened, the contents removed and sorted into groups that seemed to be organized by type or smell. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be gifts left near her tent entrance. Smooth river stones arranged in geometric patterns, and a collection of unusual feathers that didn't match any bird species Sarah could identify. The message was clear. The creatures had spent hours examining her belongings while she cowered in her tent, studying her supplies with obvious intelligence and leaving behind evidence of their visit that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Sarah's hand shook as she pulled out her phone to document the evidence, only to find that the device was completely dead, despite having been fully charged the previous day. Her camera equipment was similarly drained, every battery depleted, as if something had drawn the power from them during the night, and her backup power bank showed zero charge, despite being new and unused. The systematic failure of all her electronic devices felt deliberate, as if the creatures possessed some ability to interfere with technology or had actively worked to prevent her from documenting their presence. She was left with only her own memory and the physical evidence in the clearing, proof that something impossible had happened, but no way to capture it in a format that anyone else would believe. The decision to leave came quickly. Sarah began breaking down her camp with trembling hands, desperate to put distance between herself and the clearing before nightfall brought another encounter she might not survive. As she worked, she became aware of sounds in the forest around her, subtle indications that she was still being watched by the creatures that had visited her tent. Branches moved without wind, shadows shifted in ways that suggested massive forms moving just out of sight, and occasionally she would catch glimpses of amber eyes watching her from the darkness between the trees. The beings seemed content to observe her departure without interfering, but their presence was a constant pressure that made every movement feel like it was being evaluated and judged. Sarah's hike back to her car became a nightmare of paranoia and exhaustion, with every sound making her jump and every shadow seeming to hide something massive and aware. The trail that had been difficult to follow on her way in now seemed deliberately obscured, with landmarks she remembered appearing in wrong locations and paths that led in circles despite her compass readings. She had the growing certainty that she was being herded again, guided along specific routes by an intelligence that remained hidden but was clearly controlling her movement through the forest. The 4-hour hike stretched into 7 hours of stumbling through undergrowth and backtracking from dead ends, and Sarah began to wonder if she would ever be allowed to leave, if the creatures had decided to keep her in their territory for reasons she couldn't comprehend. When Sarah finally reached her car in the late afternoon, she found it exactly as she'd left it, but with one disturbing addition: massive handprints in the dust on her windows, prints that showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs and fingers that were far too large to be human. The creatures had found her vehicle and examined it, leaving their marks as a message, or perhaps a warning. And Sarah realized that they had known where her car was parked all along, had probably watched her arrive and followed her to the clearing. The implications were terrifying. These beings understood human technology, understood vehicles and equipment, and had been tracking her movements from the moment she entered their territory. She wasn't dealing with simple animals, but with an intelligence that had been observing humans for long enough to understand their patterns and behaviors. Sarah didn't sleep for the rest of that night, lying rigid in her sleeping bag with her backup flashlight clutched in her hand, listening for any indication that the creatures might return. As dawn finally began to lighten the sky, she worked up the courage to unzip her tent and look outside, half expecting to find no evidence of the night's encounter. What she found instead was a clearing that had been transformed overnight. Massive footprints circled her tent in perfect spirals, each print measuring at least 18 inches in length and pressed deep into the earth with a weight that suggested something far heavier than any known animal. Sarah's camping equipment had been moved and rearranged, items taken from her pack and placed in careful arrangements that suggested examination rather than random disturbance. Her food bag had been lowered to the ground and opened, the contents sorted into groups organized by type or smell. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be gifts left near her tent entrance. Smooth river stones arranged in geometric patterns, and a collection of unusual feathers that didn't match any bird species Sarah could identify. The creatures had spent hours examining her belongings while she cowered in her tent. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone to document the evidence, only to find that the device was completely dead despite having been fully charged the previous day. Her camera equipment was similarly drained, every battery depleted, as if something had drawn the power from them during the night. The systematic failure of all her electronic devices felt deliberate, as if the creatures possessed some ability to interfere with technology. The decision to leave came quickly. Sarah began breaking down her camp with trembling hands, desperate to put distance between herself and the clearing before nightfall brought another encounter. As she worked, she became aware of sounds in the forest around her. Branches moved without wind, shadows shifted in ways that suggested massive forms moving just out of sight, and occasionally she would catch glimpses of amber eyes watching her from the darkness between the trees. But as Sarah pulled up the last tent stake, something happened that made her freeze completely. From the tree line directly in front of her, one of the creatures stepped partially into view, not fully revealing itself, but allowing her to see more than she had in the darkness. In the morning light, she could make out details that her headlamp had missed. The creature's face showed expressions that were disturbingly human, its eyes tracking her movements with an intelligence that made her feel like she was being studied. It raised one massive hand and pointed deliberately toward the trail that led out of the clearing, then back at her, then toward the trail again. The message was unmistakable. It was time for her to leave. Sarah nodded slowly and began gathering her scattered equipment, noticing that other creatures had emerged from the forest at different points around the clearing, forming a loose circle that surrounded her position but maintained a calculated distance. They were all watching her with that same focused attention, and Sarah had the disturbing realization that her entire departure was being orchestrated. One of the beings made a soft vocalization, and the others responded in what sounded like agreement. As Sarah shouldered her pack and took her first steps toward the trail, the creature that had pointed the way made another sound, this one longer and more complex, with tonal variations that almost sounded like speech. It repeated the vocalization, accompanied by a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire clearing, then a motion toward Sarah herself, then a sweeping gesture toward the forest beyond. The creature appeared to be explaining something, perhaps warning her, or maybe inviting her to understand something about the relationship between its kind and this place. Sarah's hike back to her car became a nightmare of paranoia and exhaustion, with every sound making her jump and every shadow seeming to hide something massive and aware. The trail seemed deliberately obscured, with landmarks appearing in wrong locations and paths that led in circles. She had the growing certainty that she was being herded again, but this time the herding felt different, not threatening, but almost protective, as if the creatures were ensuring she stayed on safe paths. Several times she heard movement paralleling her path, and once she caught a clear glimpse of one of the massive figures keeping pace with her through the trees. The 4-hour hike stretched into 7 hours of stumbling through undergrowth and backtracking from dead ends. But then, as exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm her fear, the forest suddenly opened up and she found herself on a familiar section of trail. Despite all the confusion, she'd been guided to within a mile of where she'd parked her car. The creatures had been leading her out rather than trapping her in. When Sarah finally reached her car in the late afternoon, she found it exactly as she'd left it, but with one disturbing addition: massive handprints in the dust on her windows, prints that showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs and fingers that were far too large to be human. The creatures had found her vehicle and examined it, and Sarah realized that they had known where her car was parked all along, had probably watched her arrive, and followed her to the clearing. As Sarah sat in her car, hands still shaking too badly to put the key in the ignition, she noticed one final detail that made her blood run cold. Arranged on her hood in a careful pattern were more of those smooth river stones, positioned in the same geometric arrangement she'd seen near her tent, and tucked beneath the windshield wiper was a single unusual feather. The creatures had left her a parting gift, demonstrating that they could reach her possessions whenever they chose. Sarah started her car and drove away from the forest, watching in her rearview mirror as the trees seemed to close behind her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that amber eyes were watching her departure, that somewhere in those woods, intelligent beings were discussing what they'd learned from their night of studying the human who'd been brave or foolish enough to sleep in their territory.
Oh my God.
In November 2018, Darren Keats was driving his truck when he suddenly brutally crashed into Bigfoot, shattering his truck into pieces. The Sasquatch didn't hesitate, and what it did to Darren next soon became one of the darkest Bigfoot encounters in human history. What did Bigfoot do to him, and did he make it out of the crash alive? That November evening started like any other. Darren had loaded 42,000 pounds of Douglas fir at a staging yard near Happy Camp, a tiny logging town tucked into the Siskiyou Mountains. At approximately 11:15 p.m., Darren rounded a long, sweeping curve that opened onto a straight section of highway bordered by towering pines. That was when he saw the first shape. It appeared at the extreme edge of his headlight range, moving from left to right across the road with shocking speed. Darren's first impression was of size. Whatever had just crossed was massive, far larger than any deer or elk he had encountered in nearly 2 decades of night driving. The shape moved on 2 legs, not 4, with a loping gait that covered an impossible distance in a single stride. He caught a glimpse of dark fur, arms that seemed too long for the body, and a height that put the creature's head well above the tree line on the opposite side of the road. If that was just one of them, what else was out there beyond his headlights? His eyes scanned the tree line where the shape had disappeared, searching for any sign of movement. The fog swirled in his headlights, creating shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. For a moment, everything was silent except for the idle of his engine and the faint hiss of air pressure equalizing in the brake lines. Then he heard the sound. It started as a low rumble, so deep that Darren felt it in his chest before his ears registered it as noise. The sound built in intensity, rising to a roar that echoed across the highway embankment and reverberated through the cab of his truck. It was not the scream of a mountain lion or the bellow of an elk in rut. This was something else entirely, a vocalization that carried both power and intention, as if the creature was announcing its presence to everything within hearing range. But why announce itself unless it wanted him to know exactly where it was? Darren's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His eyes flicked to the mirrors, checking the road behind him out of instinct. What he saw made his blood run cold. A second silhouette stood in the fog, approximately 200 feet behind his trailer. Even at that distance, and through the distortion of mist, its size was unmistakable. The figure stood upright on 2 legs, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire width of the road. Its head was massive and rounded, sitting atop a neck that appeared almost non-existent, as if the skull merged directly into the torso. The creature made no move to approach or retreat. It simply stood there, watching. Darren's breathing quickened. He shifted his attention back to the road ahead, then checked the passenger side mirror. A third shape had emerged from the tree line on the right side of the highway, this one closer than the others, perhaps 75 feet away. It moved with the same deliberate slowness as the one behind him, stepping out of the forest and onto the shoulder of the road. Its outline was partially obscured by fog, but Darren could see enough to confirm that it matched the proportions of the others. Too tall, too broad, moving with a bipedal gait that no known animal in this region should possess. How many more were hidden in the fog that he couldn't see yet? The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. There were multiple individuals, and they had positioned themselves around his truck with what appeared to be coordination and intent. Darren made a decision. He released the brake and pressed the accelerator, easing the truck forward at a cautious 20 miles per hour. His eyes moved constantly between the windshield and the mirrors, tracking the positions of the shapes in the fog. The creature behind him remained stationary, but the one on the passenger side began moving parallel to his truck, matching his speed with effortless strides. As Darren increased his speed to 30 miles per hour, the creature adjusted its pace accordingly. It stayed level with his cab, maintaining a distance of roughly 50 feet. Through the fog and darkness, Darren could make out more details. The creature's arms swung in a rhythm that suggested powerful musculature, and its legs moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible for something so large. Every few seconds, its head would turn toward the truck as if checking his position. Why did it keep looking at him? What was it waiting for him to do? A sharp crack echoed from the forest on the driver's side. Darren jerked his head toward the sound and saw branches snapping as something large moved through the undergrowth, keeping pace with his truck from within the tree line. The sound of heavy footfalls reached him even over the noise of his engine, deep, rhythmic impacts that suggested enormous weight. Darren pushed the accelerator harder, bringing his speed up to 40 miles per hour. The creature on the passenger side increased its pace without apparent effort, its strides lengthening to maintain the parallel course. The one in the tree line continued its hidden pursuit, marked only by the sound of breaking branches and the occasional glimpse of movement between the trees. If they were closing in on both sides, what was about to happen next? Then something struck the front of his truck with tremendous force. The impact came from the right side, just behind the headlight assembly. Darren heard the metallic clang and felt the truck shudder slightly. He glanced at the passenger mirror in time to see a large object, roughly the size and shape of a bowling ball, bounce off his grill and tumble into the ditch. It had been a rock thrown with enough force to dent the metal housing around his headlight. The message was clear. Whatever these creatures were, they possessed not only intelligence, but also the physical capability to cause serious damage, and they wanted him to know it. Darren's survival instincts overrode his shock. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, and the truck's engine roared in response. He said that the speedometer climbed past 50 miles per hour. Darren expected the creatures to fall behind, to lose ground as his truck reached speeds that no living thing should be able to match on foot. But they did not fall behind. The shape on the passenger side accelerated with him, its loping gait transforming into a full sprint that kept it level with his cab. Darren watched in disbelief as the creature maintained a speed of 50 miles per hour, its massive frame moving with a coordination that defied everything he knew about biomechanics. The arms pumped in rhythm with the legs, the shoulders rolled forward with each stride, and the head remained steady despite the violent motion. How could something that big move like that without collapsing under its own weight? In the driver's side mirror, Darren caught glimpses of at least two more shapes emerging from the forest and joining the pursuit. They moved in a loose formation, spread across the width of the road and the adjacent shoulder, their positions suggesting tactical awareness rather than random chase behavior. The highway ahead curved sharply to the left, a turn that Darren had navigated countless times, but never at this speed. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands and leaned into the curve, feeling the trailer sway as centrifugal force pulled it toward the outside edge of the turn. His tires screamed against the asphalt, and for a moment he thought he might lose control. If the truck tipped here, would the creatures even let him crawl out alive? But the truck held the line, and Darren emerged from the curve still accelerating. He checked his mirrors immediately, hoping that the sharp turn had finally broken the pursuit. The creatures were still there, all of them. They had taken the curve by cutting through the forest on the inside of the turn, emerging back onto the road just as Darren straightened out. If anything, they seemed closer now, having gained ground by taking the shorter path through the trees. Darren's mind raced. These things were not just fast, they were intelligent enough to anticipate his route and adjust their pursuit accordingly. They were herding him, pushing him forward along a path of their choosing, and he had no idea where that path led or what waited at the end of it. Was he driving toward an escape or directly into a trap? The speedometer read 55 miles per hour and climbing. The fog had thickened, reducing visibility to less than 200 feet. Darren's headlights created a tunnel of light through the mist, but beyond that tunnel, the world disappeared into gray nothingness. He was driving blind, trusting muscle memory and the faint guidance of the center line to keep him on the road. A massive hand slapped against the side of his trailer with a sound like a gunshot. The entire truck shuddered from the impact, and Darren heard metal groan and buckle. One of the creatures had gotten close enough to strike his vehicle while running at full speed. a feat that should have been physically impossible. If they could hit the trailer, how long before one reached the cab? Darren laid on the horn, filling the night with a long, blaring note that echoed across the forest. He hoped the noise might startle the creatures, might cause them to break off their pursuit. Instead, the sound seemed to energize them. A chorus of howls rose from multiple directions, overlapping and harmonizing in a way that suggested communication rather than random vocalization. They were coordinating, sharing information, working together. The fog grew denser still, and Darren realized with growing horror that the creatures were using it as cover. In the reduced visibility, they could approach closer without being seen, could position themselves for attacks that he would not see coming until it was too late. A heavy thud sounded from directly above his head. Darren's eyes shot upward to the cab's ceiling. Something was on the roof of his truck. He heard the scrape of claws or nails dragging across metal, followed by the distinct sound of weight shifting from one side to the other. The creature had somehow climbed onto his moving vehicle and was now crouched on top of the cab, mere inches above his head. If one had made it up there, how many more were waiting for a chance to follow? The roof dented inward with a tremendous crash as the creature brought its full weight down in a single stomp. The metal buckled, creating a depression roughly 2 feet in diameter directly above the driver's seat. Darren ducked instinctively, even though the roof had not collapsed entirely. He could hear the creature moving again, repositioning itself for another strike. Darren jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, then immediately back to the left, fishtailing the truck in a desperate attempt to shake the creature loose. The trailer swayed violently behind him, threatening to jackknife. The creature on the roof lost its grip and tumbled off the side of the cab, hitting the pavement with a heavy thud that Darren felt through his seat. He checked the mirror and saw the creature roll twice before coming to a stop in the middle of the road. For a split second, Darren thought he had injured it, maybe even killed it. Then the shape stood up, apparently unharmed, and immediately resumed its pursuit. Highway signs flashed past in the fog, mile markers, curve warnings, speed limit postings, all of them meaningless in the context of what was happening. Darren was no longer driving a route. He was fleeing for his life, and every instinct told him that slowing down meant death. If he couldn't stop and couldn't slow, how long before something forced him to? The highway ahead split into 2 options: continue straight on the main route or veer right onto a narrower mountain road that climbed into higher elevation. Under normal circumstances, Darren would have stayed on the main highway. But nothing about this situation was normal, and the creatures behind him showed no signs of tiring or giving up. He made a split-second decision and yanked the wheel to the right, taking the turnoff at a speed that made his trailer swing wide and his tires howl in protest. The mountain road was narrower than the highway, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass each other. The road surface was rougher here, less maintained, with potholes and cracks that jolted the truck with every impact. Darren's speed dropped to 45 miles per hour as he navigated the winding ascent, his headlights sweeping across walls of pine and Douglas fir that seemed to lean inward, creating a claustrophobic tunnel. He checked his mirrors and felt a surge of hope. The creatures were no longer visible behind him. Perhaps the sudden turn had caught them off guard, or maybe they had chosen not to follow him onto this secondary route. For the first time in what felt like hours but had probably been less than 15 minutes, Darren allowed himself to believe he might escape. That hope died within seconds. Movement flickered between the trees on both sides of the road. Darren caught glimpses of large shapes moving parallel to his truck, weaving through the forest with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. They were not running on the road anymore, they were using the forest itself, moving through terrain that would have stopped a human cold. Branches snapped and undergrowth crashed as multiple individuals kept pace with his truck, sometimes visible for a moment before disappearing behind the next stand of trees. If they could run through terrain like that, what terrain could possibly slow them? Darren counted at least 4 distinct shapes, 2 on each side of the road. But the fog and darkness made it difficult to be certain. There could have been more, hidden in the deeper shadows or moving further back in the forest. The realization settled over him like a weight. He had not escaped. He had simply changed the battlefield, and the creatures had adapted instantly. The road curved sharply to the left, and Darren took the turn as fast as he dared. As he came out of the curve, his headlights illuminated something that made him slam on the brakes so hard that his load shifted forward with a grinding screech. One of the creatures stood in the middle of the road, directly in his path. It was closer than any of the others had been, close enough that Darren could see details that his mind struggled to process. The creature stood at least 9 feet tall, with a body covered in dark reddish-brown fur that appeared matted and dirty. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that looked almost human, but were easily twice the size of Darren's own. The shoulders were impossibly broad, giving the torso a triangular shape that tapered down to a narrow waist. But it was the face that held Darren's attention. A flat, almost human-like visage with a pronounced brow ridge, a wide nose, and eyes that reflected his headlights with a golden-green glow. The creature did not move. It simply stood there, blocking the road, watching him with an expression that Darren could only describe as calculated. It was not the blank stare of an animal caught in headlights. This was the gaze of something intelligent, something that understood exactly what it was doing. Was this the moment they finally forced him to stop? Darren's truck had slowed to less than 20 miles per hour, but he had not stopped completely. His foot hovered over the brake pedal, his mind racing through options. He could not reverse. The road behind him was too narrow and winding, and the other creatures were back there somewhere. He could not go around. The shoulders on both sides dropped off into steep ditches filled with rocks and fallen timber. The only way forward was through the creature blocking his path. Before he could make a decision, movement in his passenger mirror caught his attention. Another shape had emerged from the tree line on the right side of the road, positioning itself at an angle that would cut off any attempt to swerve around the first creature. A third appeared on the left side, completing the blockade. Was he already surrounded in a trap he couldn't break? The creature in front of him took a single step forward, closing the distance by several feet. The movement was deliberate and slow, designed to intimidate rather than attack. Darren's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His breathing came in short, rapid gasps, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. Another step forward. The creature was now less than 50 feet from his front bumper. Darren made his choice. He pressed the accelerator and aimed directly at the creature blocking the road. The truck lurched forward, engine roaring as it built speed. The creature remained motionless, watching his approach with those unsettling golden eyes. Would sheer momentum be enough to punch through their line? At the last possible second, the creature moved. It did not leap aside or retreat into the forest. Instead, it stepped to the left just enough to avoid a direct collision, and as Darren's truck passed, it reached out with one massive arm and struck the side of the trailer. The impact was devastating. Metal shrieked and tore as claws raked across the aluminum siding, leaving deep gouges that ran the entire length of the trailer. The truck shuddered from the force of the blow, and Darren fought to keep it on the road as the trailer fishtailed behind him. He heard something else too, a sound that made his stomach drop. The creature had not just struck the trailer, it had grabbed onto it. Darren accelerated harder, pushing the truck up to 50 miles per hour despite the narrow, winding road. In his mirror, he could see the creature clinging to the back corner of the trailer, its body pressed against the metal as it held on with apparent ease. Its legs dragged along the pavement, creating a shower of sparks, but it showed no sign of letting go. If it could hang on at 50, what happened when the others closed in? The road began to climb more steeply, and Darren shifted down to maintain speed. The engine screamed in protest, but the truck continued its ascent. Behind him, the creature finally released its grip and dropped away, rolling across the pavement before disappearing into the fog. But Darren knew it would not stay down for long. None of them had. The forest on both sides of the road grew denser as he climbed higher into the mountains. Shapes continued to move through the trees on both sides. Darren could not see them clearly anymore, but he could hear them, the crash of undergrowth, the snap of branches, the heavy thud of footfalls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They were still with him, still pacing his truck, still herding him towards some unknown destination. The road leveled out briefly, and Darren took advantage of the flat section to push his speed back up to 55 miles per hour. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, enough to keep running for hours if necessary. But he knew he could not maintain this pace indefinitely. The truck was taking damage with every impact and near miss. The windshield had developed several cracks from flying debris. The grille was dented and partially collapsed. The trailer had been struck multiple times, and he had no idea how much structural integrity remained. How much more damage could the rig take before it simply fell apart under him? More importantly, Darren himself was beginning to tire. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the initial encounter was starting to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made his hands shake and his vision blur at the edges. He had been driving for hours before this nightmare began, and the physical and mental strain of the pursuit was taking its toll. A sharp curve appeared ahead with almost no warning. Darren hit the brakes and downshifted, but he was going too fast. The truck's rear wheels broke traction, and the trailer began to swing out to the right. For a terrifying moment, Darren thought he was going to jackknife and roll the entire rig down the mountainside. He turned into the skid, fighting the wheel, and somehow managed to straighten out just as the road curved back in the opposite direction. If he barely survived that turn, how many more waited ahead? As he came out of the second curve, the forest suddenly opened up. The trees fell away on both sides, replaced by a massive clearing that stretched for what looked like half a mile or more. The road ran straight through the center of the clearing, a ribbon of asphalt cutting across open ground, covered in low grass and scattered boulders. Darren's first thought was relief. In the open, he would be able to see the creatures coming. There would be no more ambushes from the tree line, no more shapes appearing out of nowhere. He could finally open up the throttle and put real distance between himself and his pursuers. He pressed the accelerator to the floor. But if they'd herded him this far, did they want him out in the open? Darren checked his mirrors and felt his blood turn to ice. The creatures had emerged from the tree line behind him and were now running in full pursuit down the open road. There were at least 6 of them, possibly more, spread across the width of the highway in a formation that looked disturbingly organized. They ran with a loping gait that covered enormous distances with each stride, their arms pumping, their shoulders rolling forward like gorillas in mid-charge. And they were gaining. Darren watched in horror as the distance between his truck and the lead creature slowly but steadily decreased. 70 miles per hour was not enough. He pushed harder, coaxing every bit of speed he could from the straining engine. 75 miles per hour. The truck shook violently, and Darren could hear components rattling and grinding in ways that suggested imminent mechanical failure. Would pushing the truck any harder buy him time or destroy his only chance at survival? The creatures continued to close the gap. The lead individual was now less than 200 feet behind his trailer, running at a speed that Darren's rational mind insisted was impossible. Nothing that large should be able to move that fast. The laws of physics, of biology, of everything he understood about the natural world said that what he was seeing could not be real. But it was real. The creature was there, in his mirror, getting closer with every second. 80 miles per hour. Darren had never driven this truck at such speed on anything but a straight, flat interstate. The steering felt loose and imprecise, and every small irregularity in the road surface sent jolts through the frame that threatened to tear the vehicle apart. But he could not slow down. Slowing down meant being caught, meant death. He was certain of that now. But how long could he keep control before the road or the truck betrayed him? The lead creature was less than 100 feet behind him. Darren could see its face in the mirror, the flat features, the pronounced brow, the eyes that glowed with reflected light. Its mouth was open, revealing teeth that looked far too large and sharp for any primate. Its chest heaved with exertion, but it showed no signs of slowing or giving up. 85 miles per hour. The truck was at its absolute limit. The engine screamed, the transmission whined, and the entire vehicle felt like it might shake itself apart at any moment. Darren's hands ached from gripping the wheel so tightly, and his eyes burned from staring into the fog-shrouded darkness ahead. And then he saw it. Far ahead, at the extreme edge of his headlight range, another shape stood in the middle of the road. The shape ahead grew larger in his headlights. Darren could see details now: the massive frame, the long arms, the broad shoulders. It stood with its feet planted wide, its body angled slightly forward, as if bracing for impact. And Darren understood. This creature was not going to move. He kept his foot on the accelerator. 85 miles per hour. The distance closed rapidly. 500 feet, 400, 300. The creature remained motionless, its eyes locked on the approaching truck. 200 feet, 100. At the last possible instant, the creature leaned forward, lowering its center of gravity, preparing itself for the collision. Darren's truck struck the creature at full speed. The impact was unlike anything Darren had experienced in 17 years of commercial driving. The front grille collapsed inward with a sound like a bomb detonating, metal crumpling and tearing as it absorbed the force of striking something that weighed at least 600 pounds. The entire truck shuddered violently, and for a moment Darren thought the frame itself might snap in half. If the truck failed here, what would stop the others from tearing him out of the wreckage? The creature's body rolled under the front of the truck with a series of sickening thuds that Darren felt through the floor beneath his feet. The suspension groaned and compressed as the massive weight passed underneath, and the steering wheel jerked violently in his hands as the front wheels struck the body. The trailer behind him swayed dangerously, fishtailing across both lanes as the sudden deceleration transferred through the coupling. The fog thickened, and the sounds of pursuit returned immediately. Branches snapped and undergrowth cracked as multiple shapes surged forward, keeping pace effortlessly alongside the rig. Darren swerved slightly to avoid a low-hanging branch, feeling the tires slide on loose gravel at the edge of the road. He said that every heartbeat, every jolt, was a reminder that the creatures were relentless. He pressed the accelerator harder, forcing the rig past 75 miles per hour. The engine shrieked, warning lights flickered, and the trailer bounced violently, threatening to throw him off course. Shadows flickered in the mirrors, more than one pair of massive limbs moving in perfect rhythm with the truck. Darren's knuckles turned white from gripping the wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to survive. Could he maintain control while these monsters matched his every move? And then, a sudden jolt from the trailer nearly threw him from his seat. One of the creatures had leapt against the side of the rig, gripping the load with brute strength. The logs tumbled off the trailer, spilling into the road with a thunderous crash. Darren fought to keep control as the trailer swerved wildly. The pack halted abruptly at the edge of the spilled logs, their movement freezing as they circled the debris. Darren's heart hammered in his chest. They were inspecting the mess, but they did not pursue further. The threat had shifted. The immediate danger had ended. He eased off the accelerator, his chest heaving, and dared a glance in the mirrors. The shapes had stopped, lingering near the broken cargo, leaving him a path forward, but the road ahead was still littered with the remnants of his narrow escape. Darren pressed the accelerator and increased his speed, putting distance between himself and the scene behind him. He kept checking the mirrors, waiting for the pursuit to resume, but the creatures remained where they were. As the distance grew, they became smaller and less distinct, until finally the fog swallowed them entirely, and Darren could see nothing but an empty road behind him. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, rifle in hand, Corin paused beside a massive hemlock, his attention drawn to a series of broken branches, roughly 8 feet above the ground. The breaks were fresh, sap still glistening at the fracture points, and the pattern suggested something large had pushed through the area with considerable force. As he stood to continue tracking, a sound rolled through the forest that made him freeze. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, vibrating through his chest before rising into a guttural vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere. The call lasted perhaps 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving only the whisper of wind through the canopy. He adjusted the rifle slung across his shoulder and moved forward, following the line of prints as they led him deeper into the forest. The tracks were easy to follow at first, each footfall leaving a clear impression in the moss and soft earth. But after roughly 200 yards, the pattern changed. The prints became shallower, the stride length irregular, as if the creature had begun moving more carefully, aware that it was being followed. At 10:15, Corin reached a small clearing where the forest opened briefly before closing in again. He stopped at the edge, scanning the area with the methodical attention that had kept him alive in predator territory for over a decade. The clearing showed signs of recent disturbance. Ferns had been trampled in a rough circle approximately 30 feet in diameter, and several saplings had been bent nearly to the ground, their trunks showing stress fractures, but not completely broken. Then he saw the arrangement. In the center of the clearing, someone or something had stacked river stones in a cairn roughly 4 feet high. The stones were too large to have been carried by any animal smaller than a full-grown human, yet the nearest riverbed was over half a mile away through dense terrain. Around the cairn, arranged in a spiral pattern, were bones, deer ribs, what appeared to be elk vertebrae, and several smaller skeletal elements that Corin couldn't immediately identify. The arrangement was too precise to be random scavenger activity. Each bone had been placed at deliberate intervals, creating a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. Corin approached the cairn cautiously, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle. As he circled the structure, documenting it with his camera, he became aware of a sound that made his skin crawl. A rhythmic clicking echoed from the forest around him, coming from one direction. 3 quick clicks, pause, 2 clicks, pause, repeat. The pattern was too regular to be natural, too coordinated to be coincidental. He finished photographing the cairn and moved quickly toward the far side of the clearing where the tracks resumed. But as he reached the tree line, something massive moved in his peripheral vision. Corin spun, bringing his rifle up, and caught a glimpse of a dark shape disappearing behind a cluster of cedars roughly 60 yards to his left. The figure was upright, easily 8 feet tall, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. His heart hammered as he tracked the movement through his rifle scope, but the creature had vanished into the dense undergrowth. Only the swaying of branches marked its passage, and even that settled quickly, leaving no clear indication of which direction it had gone. The clicking sound intensified, now coming from ahead of him rather than behind, as if whatever was out there had circled around while he was focused on the cairn. Corin made a decision that would define the next several hours. Instead of retreating to reassess, he pushed forward, following the tracks as they led him along a ridgeline that overlooked a steep ravine. The terrain was becoming more challenging, the forest floor littered with fallen logs and dense undergrowth that made silent movement nearly impossible. Every step seemed to announce his presence, yet the clicking sounds maintained their distance, always just beyond visual range, but close enough to remind him that he was being monitored. At 11:40, the forest changed. The clicking stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Corin said he could hear his own heartbeat. He paused beside a massive cedar, scanning the area through his rifle scope. Then he heard it. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the forest, each impact sending vibrations through the ground beneath his feet. The sound was unmistakable. Something large was moving toward him, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. Corin estimated the source at roughly 100 yards ahead, moving along the same ridgeline he was following. The thuds came at regular intervals, suggesting bipedal locomotion, each footfall carrying the weight of something massive. He moved off the trail, positioning himself behind a fallen log that offered both cover and a clear line of sight down the ridge. Through his scope, he watched the tree line, waiting for whatever was approaching to reveal itself. The thuds grew louder, closer, accompanied now by the sound of branches snapping and undergrowth being pushed aside. Whatever was coming wasn't bothering with stealth anymore. At approximately 120 yards, Corin saw movement. A massive shape emerged from behind a cluster of hemlocks, moving with deliberate purpose along the ridge. Even at that distance, the creature's size was staggering. It stood fully upright, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the space between trees. Its body was covered in dark reddish-brown fur, thick and coarse, catching the filtered sunlight in a way that made it seem almost to glow. Corin watched through his scope as the creature approached a point roughly 80 yards from his position. He could see details now that the distance had hidden before. The face was distinctly primate, with a pronounced brow ridge and a jaw that suggested incredible bite force. But the eyes were what held his attention. Even at this distance, he could see intelligence in that gaze. Not the simple awareness of an animal, but something deeper, more complex, suggesting cognitive capability far beyond instinct. The creature stopped suddenly, its head snapping toward Corin's position with startling precision. For several seconds, man and creature regarded each other across the distance. Corin's finger moved to his rifle's trigger, but something in the creature's posture suggested it posed no immediate threat. It simply stood there, watching him with the same attention he was giving it. Before Corin could react, the creature dropped to all fours and exploded into motion. Not toward him, but parallel to his position, moving along the ridge with shocking speed. Within seconds, it had covered over 50 yards, its massive form weaving between trees with an agility that seemed impossible for something so large. Corin tracked it through his scope, but the creature was already disappearing into the dense forest, leaving only swaying branches and disturbed undergrowth to mark its passage. He checked his GPS coordinates and marked his current position, then began moving along the ridge, following the direction the creature had taken. But with each step, the sense of being watched intensified. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of his vision, always just beyond clear sight. Branches would snap in the distance, then fall silent when he turned to investigate. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Corin discovered something that confirmed his growing suspicion. He had been following what appeared to be a game trail when he noticed that several large logs had been positioned across the path at strategic intervals. The logs were too large to have fallen naturally into such precise placement, and their arrangement created a series of obstacles that funneled movement in a specific direction. He said that he photographed the log placement and continued forward, but now he moved with increased caution. The trail was leading him exactly where something wanted him to go, and every instinct told him that following it further would be a mistake. Yet turning back meant abandoning the pursuit, and after coming this far, he said that the option felt impossible. At 2:15, Corin reached a point where the trail split. One path continued down toward the ravine, while the other curved back up toward higher ground. He paused, studying both options, when a rock tumbled down the slope to his left. He spun toward the sound, rifle ready, and caught a glimpse of movement roughly 40 yards upslope, the same massive shape, moving through the trees with the same fluid grace. The creature paused, partially visible behind a Douglas fir, and Corin realized it was deliberately showing itself. The message was clear. I know where you are. I control this terrain, and I am guiding your movements. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was the prey. Corin chose the upward path, refusing to be funneled toward the ravine. His decision was met with immediate response. The clicking sounds intensified, becoming more rapid and agitated, and within seconds he heard movement on both sides of the trail. Whatever was out there didn't want him going that direction, and it was making its displeasure known through coordinated vocalizations that echoed through the forest like a warning system. He pushed forward anyway, climbing over fallen logs and through dense undergrowth that seemed to grow thicker with every step. The terrain fought him, branches whipping across his face, roots catching his boots, the slope steepening until he was using his hands as much as his feet to maintain progress. And through it all, he could hear it moving parallel to his position, keeping pace effortlessly while he struggled through obstacles that seemed almost deliberately placed. At 3 o'clock, Corin reached a small plateau and stopped to catch his breath. His GPS showed he had covered less than half a mile in the past 45 minutes, the difficult terrain slowing his progress to a crawl. He checked his equipment, ensuring his rifle was clear of debris and his ammunition remained dry. He pulled out his thermal optics and scanned the surrounding forest. The device was military-grade, capable of detecting heat signatures at distances up to 300 yards. What he saw made his breath catch. A large heat signature near his position, positioned at roughly 30 yards from him. It wasn't moving, just maintaining its position, as if waiting for him to make his next move. Corin made a decision that would escalate the encounter beyond simple observation. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air, the report echoing through the forest like thunder. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The heat signature on his thermal display exploded into motion, not fleeing, but advancing, closing the perimeter with precision. The clicking sounds transformed into deeper vocalizations, low, resonant calls that seemed to vibrate through his chest. He shouldered his pack and moved quickly along the plateau, heading toward what appeared to be a gap in the advancing perimeter. But as he ran, he realized the gap was deliberate. It was giving him an escape route, steering him once again toward the ravine he had tried to avoid. Every other direction was blocked by obstacles, leaving him only one option if he wanted to avoid direct confrontation. The forest opened ahead, and Corin found himself at the edge of a steep slope that descended into a narrow valley. He started down, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. He used saplings and exposed roots to control his descent, but the slope was steeper than it had appeared from above, and within minutes he was sliding more than climbing, fighting to maintain any semblance of control. Halfway down, Corin heard a sound that made him freeze despite the precarious footing. A massive shape appeared at the top of the slope, silhouetted against the sky. The creature stood fully upright, watching his descent with obvious interest. Then, in a display that demonstrated both intelligence and physical capability far beyond any known animal, it dropped to all fours and began descending the slope parallel to his position, moving with shocking speed and control across terrain that had him barely maintaining balance. Corin tried to increase his pace, but the slope was too unstable. His right foot hit a patch of loose shale, and he went down hard, sliding 20 feet before catching himself on an exposed root. Pain shot through his shoulder where he had impacted a rock, but he forced himself upright and continued downward. The creature maintained its parallel descent, never closing the distance, but never falling behind, demonstrating complete mastery of terrain that was defeating him. At the bottom of the slope, Corin stumbled into the fog-shrouded valley floor. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and visibility was reduced to perhaps 30 feet in any direction. He could hear water running somewhere nearby, suggesting a creek or stream, but the fog distorted sound in ways that made direction difficult to determine. He pulled out his thermal optics again and immediately wished he hadn't. The display showed a heat signature positioned at roughly 40 to 50 yards. It had descended while he was fighting the slope, and now it had him effectively trapped in the valley bottom. But it wasn't advancing, just maintaining its position, as if waiting for something. The realization crept over him slowly. It was studying him, observing his behavior, treating him the way a researcher might observe a specimen in controlled conditions. Corin decided to try communication. He had read reports of researchers attempting vocal interaction with unknown primates, using a combination of wood knocks and vocalizations to establish non-threatening intent. He found a fallen branch and struck it against a tree trunk 3 times, then waited. The response came within seconds, 3 knocks from the fog ahead of him, perfectly mimicking his pattern. He tried a different sequence. 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. The response matched exactly, coming from a different direction this time. He attempted vocalization next, producing a low, sustained call that he hoped would be interpreted as non-aggressive. The forest fell silent for several seconds, then erupted with a response. Vocalization came from one direction, distinct in tone and pitch. The call was complex, carrying inflections and patterns that seemed almost linguistic. It was possibly talking to him in a language he couldn't begin to understand. Movement in the fog caught his attention. A massive shape emerged from the mist roughly 20 yards ahead, moving with deliberate slowness. Corin raised his rifle but didn't aim, keeping the barrel pointed at the ground in what he hoped was a non-threatening posture. The creature stopped at the edge of clear visibility, partially obscured by fog, but close enough that he could see details that the distance had previously hidden. The face was remarkably expressive, with eyes that tracked his every movement with obvious intelligence. The creature's posture suggested caution rather than aggression. Shoulders slightly hunched, arms held loosely at its sides, head tilted in what appeared to be curiosity. For several seconds, they regarded each other through the fog, neither moving, both assessing the situation. Then the creature did something that shattered any remaining doubt about its cognitive capability. It raised one massive hand and gestured toward Corin's rifle, then shook its head slowly from side to side. The message was unmistakable. The weapon was unnecessary. Corin found himself lowering the rifle despite every survival instinct screaming at him to maintain a defensive posture. The creature nodded once, a gesture of approval or perhaps acknowledgement, then stepped back into the fog and disappeared. Corin checked his GPS and realized he had been pushed nearly 2 miles from his original tracking location. The creature had effectively herded him through the forest, controlling his movement with a combination of intimidation, terrain manipulation, and coordinated positioning. Every choice he thought he had made independently had actually been guided, funneled toward outcomes it had predetermined. The hunt he thought he was conducting had been an illusion from the start. He decided to attempt establishing a more permanent observation position. Using his remaining daylight, he set up a basic camp in a small clearing near the creek. He positioned motion-activated cameras at strategic points around the perimeter, each one equipped with infrared capability for night observation. He scattered bait, dried venison, and fish at intervals designed to attract investigation. And he prepared several simple snares using paracord and spring-loaded mechanisms, not with any real expectation of capturing something so large, but to test whether it would recognize and avoid obvious traps. As darkness fell, the heat signature that had been haunting him earlier had withdrawn to a greater distance, but it remained present, positioned in a loose perimeter roughly 100 yards out. It was giving him space, but it hadn't left. At 8:30 that evening, his first motion camera triggered. Corin checked the feed on his portable monitor and saw a massive shape approaching one of his bait stations. The creature moved with obvious caution, pausing frequently to scan the area before advancing. When it reached the bait, it didn't simply grab the food and retreat. Instead, it examined the entire setup, looking at the camera from multiple angles, studying the way the bait had been positioned, even checking the surrounding area for additional equipment. Then, the creature picked up the camera, turned it to face directly at Corin's position, and set it back down. Over the next 3 hours, similar scenes played out at each of his camera positions. The creature approached his bait stations, examined his equipment, and in several cases deliberately disabled his cameras by covering the lenses with mud and vegetation. It avoided his snares with casual ease, in some cases stepping over the trigger mechanisms with precision that suggested it understood exactly how the traps functioned. The creature even dismantled a snare completely, laying out the components in a neat line as if providing a lesson in trap construction. By midnight, Corin's carefully planned observation network had been systematically neutralized. His cameras were disabled or repositioned, his bait was gone, and his traps had been rendered useless. And through it all, the creature had maintained its perimeter, never approaching his actual camp, but making it abundantly clear that it controlled the situation completely. He tried using thermal calls next, playing recorded vocalizations through a portable speaker. The creature responded immediately, but not in the way he expected. Instead of answering his recorded calls, it began producing vocalizations that perfectly mimicked his own voice. Words and phrases he had spoken earlier in the day played back with startling accuracy. The psychological impact was profound. Corin realized he wasn't just being observed, he was being studied with the same methodical attention he had intended to apply. Every action he took was being analyzed, cataloged, and apparently understood at a level that suggested a cognitive capability approaching or possibly exceeding human intelligence. He managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful rest before dawn began filtering through the fog. When he emerged from his tent, he found his camp had been visited during the night. In the center, someone or something had constructed a small cairn identical to the one he had found the previous day. Arranged around it in a spiral pattern were bones, not animal bones this time, but his own equipment. Batteries from his cameras, memory cards from his recording devices, even the firing pin from one of his backup rifles, somehow removed with surgical precision while he slept. Corin stood in the center of his violated camp, the implications settling over him like the morning fog. Everything he had brought to document and potentially capture this creature had been systematically identified, examined, and neutralized. He made a decision that would define the remainder of his time in the forest. If observation and documentation had failed, he would attempt a terminal solution. His remaining equipment included a high-powered .308 rifle loaded with soft-point rounds designed for maximum trauma and controlled expansion, several lengths of high-tensile rope, and a field dressing kit. The plan was desperate and probably foolish, but the alternative was leaving empty-handed after being systematically outmaneuvered by something that wasn't supposed to exist. Corin spent the morning preparing. He identified a narrow section of the ravine where the terrain would funnel movement, creating a natural choke point. He positioned his rifle with clear sight lines and prepared a drag path. The setup was professional, based on techniques he had used successfully on elk and bear. But even as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By noon, his ambush was ready. He positioned himself in a concealed blind roughly 40 yards from the choke point, his rifle loaded and ready. Then he did something calculated to draw attention. He activated an electronic caller that produced distress vocalizations of a deer fawn, a sound that typically attracted predators from considerable distances. Then he saw movement. A massive shape emerged from the tree line roughly 100 yards from his position, moving with obvious caution toward the electronic caller. It was enormous, perhaps 8.5 feet tall, its dark fur matted with dew and forest duff. Corin's breath hitched. This was the one. The intelligence in its movements was palpable, a calculated survey of the space. It paused, head tilting, and for a moment its eyes seemed to lock directly onto his blind. Corin raised the rifle, his crosshairs settling not on the center mass, but on the thick muscle of the creature's upper leg. He needed it immobilized, not destroyed. The report of the rifle cracked through the ravine. The creature roared, a sound of profound shock and betrayal that seemed to shake the fog from the branches. As it stumbled, a dark spray erupting from its thigh. It didn't flee blindly, but turned with a staggering lurch, one massive hand clamping over the wound as it began dragging itself toward the dense timber with terrifying, purposeful speed, leaving a wide, glistening trail in the pine needles. Corin waited a full 10 minutes, letting the shock and blood loss do their work. When he moved from the blind, the sign was unmistakable. Great splashes of crimson on the fern heads, smears on the bark of passing trees where the creature had braced itself. The trail led not in a panicked line, but in a deliberate, agonizing zigzag, utilizing deadfall and thickets for cover. It was still thinking, still trying to lose him. For 2 hours he tracked it, a grim procession through the silent woods. The blood pattern changed, from bright arterial spurts to a steady, ominous drip as the creature's heart laboriously compensated. He found where it had paused to pack moss against the wound, a crude but effective field dressing. He found where it had doubled back 50 yards to traverse a rocky creek bed, forcing Corin to spend precious minutes finding where it exited on the far side, a single bloody print on a dry stone. The chase became a perverse dialogue, the creature employing every evasive tactic Corin had ever read about in hunting manuals. Corin doggedly reading the story written in the soil. The trail finally led deeper into a dank hollow strewn with the skeletal remains of a long-ago avalanche, a tomb of deadfall and rotting cedar. The air grew cold and still. The blood was everywhere now, soaked into the ground, painting the roots. He found it there, propped against the base of a rotten cedar as if it had chosen its final resting place. Its chest heaved in slow, ragged bellows. The intelligence was still there in its eyes, watching him approach with a weary, ancient comprehension that made his skin crawl. It made no attempt to rise, no final defensive gesture. It simply watched, its gaze holding a terrible, exhausted knowledge. It made no sound as he raised the rifle a second time, settling the sights between its eyes, and ended it. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than before. Corin worked quickly in that profound quiet, the adrenaline sharp and metallic in his throat. Using his hunting saw and skinning knife, he separated the massive head from the torso. The work was gruesome, mechanical. The weight was tremendous, the fur coarse and thick under his blood-slicked hands. The neck musculature was like cable, the vertebrae dense. He wrapped the trophy in a green tarp, which immediately began to bloom with dark, wet stains, and secured the bundle with rope before beginning the long, grueling drag back toward his camp. That night, in the cone of his headlamp, he examined his prize. The features were a brutal paradox, a pronounced sagittal crest, suggestive of primal power, but a brow and jawline that held a disquieting, almost human proportion. The eyes, half-lidded, seemed to hold a final, frozen judgment. He had won. He had proof. But as he sat in the firelight, the massive skull cleaned and packed beside him, a cold understanding seeped in. The cairn of bones, the mimicked voice, the surgical disarmament of his camp. These were not the acts of a mere animal. They were the acts of a person. The deliberate zigzag of the blood trail, the use of the stream, the moss packed in the wound. These were the strategies of a mind, not an instinct. And he had not outmaneuvered it. It had simply run out of time, its body failing its brilliant, desperate mind. He had come to study a legend and had instead committed a murder. The trophy beside him was no longer just evidence. It was an artifact of a crime, and its weight felt less like a victory and more like a sentence handed down by the silent, watching trees. He had caught his monster, and in doing so, had unmasked his own. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.